In the 70s a gang beat up my dad and put him in the hospital. So he got revenge on all of them. This isn't my story, but rather my dad's. I know the believability of this might be hard, but I believe this story to be true. My dad was a very nice and hard-working man with some of the greatest patience for bullshit I've ever seen. But he also had a temper that could make an angry moose turn the other way if he was pushed far enough. Well, when this happened he was definitely pushed far enough. He told this to me after I told him all of the things I did to prank evil Mama Bear before moving out of her house. He told me this story once and only once about 10 years ago and never spoke of it again. I wrote it down in a journal from memory back then so I wouldn't forget. So I'll try and retell it as best as I can from what I wrote in the journal a decade ago. And if any of you thought my revenge streak I did on my mother before moving out was too much with the gnomes and laxative, what my father did was much more brutal. And probably explains where I got my conniving side from. This story happened in the late 70s. My dad was a young man striking out on his own for the first time. He lived alone in a really crappy part of town while attending college and working at a gas station as a steady job. But the area had lots of thugs, and lots of violence. There was a group of guys he knew from high school that just loved to mess with him. The first thing they did was spray paint graffiti all over his car, a '68 Chevy Nova. Then they started harassing him every night he was coming home from work or class because they were always hanging around his building. The leader of the gang was a big guy Dad referred to as Ted. Don't know if this was his real name or not. Ted was a relentless bully to several other kids in school. He beat up my dad many times over the years, but in high school in particular he hated my dad because Ted failed and dropped out during senior year since they wouldn't let him play football with his failing grades anymore. My dad on the other hand finished with some pretty decent grades and got a partial scholarship to a local community college. So to say Ted resented my dad was putting it mildly. And one day when my dad was going into his apartment, Ted and his gang ambushed him and beat him terribly in a back alley. My dad laid bloody and unconscious in that alley all night. He was found in the morning by an old lady walking her dog and she called for help. He was in the hospital for months with several broken bones and head trauma, and this caused him to lose out on a lot of his college classes and he had to retake them. Of course he told police it was Ted and his cronies that beat him up, but the police weren't very good at their jobs, and claimed they had no evidence that Ted did it because he and his friends all supposedly had alibis and there were no other witnesses. Well, that didn't sit well with my dad. He spent some time in physical recovery after getting out of the hospital and then moved to a new apartment with a friend as a roommate. And together they plotted his revenge on Ted. My dad told me that back then if police failed you, then you took payback into your own hands. Now a thing of note is that my grandfather on my dad's side worked at the city dump, and he was always bringing things home to collect, donate, fix, resell, etc. My dad helped him out with this a lot, so he learned a lot about fixing and making things. And while with his father at work he found ways of sneaking into the dump at night, and as a teenager he would sneak in there at night with friends to find stuff they used to build a hidden fort in the woods nearby. My dad said the fort was so well made that it even had a makeshift wood stove that they made out of recycled bricks and a metal barrel to use in winter to keep the fort warm. This is important later. So over a few nights my dad and his friends snuck into the dump just like they used to in order to look around for things they could use. Bit by bit they found some old stinky clothes, shoes, and some old wooden baseball bats, and a few other useful things for the revenge. The dump also had an assortment of used tools the employees found in the trash and set aside to be used on site, but also regularly borrowed. So no one really kept track of them. My dad and his friend kept all of the stuff they were going to use hidden at the old fort they made as teenagers near the dump, so they had a perfect place to build the tools of their revenge. Next they made sure they had as solid of an alibi as they could make. Check out the intense revenge in part 2 post in 1 hour, turn on your notifications and get ready.